In the past few weeks, we've been working on finding the slope from graphs, tables, and 2 points. And now we're going to tie it all together by writing those things actually in an equation called slope-intercept form. In a slope-intercept equation, you always have this basic outline, y equals mx plus b. This is what you're going to be seeing a lot over the next few weeks. Our first important thing that we need to worry about is our m value. Our m value is our actual slope number. So whatever the slope is from the graph or the table or the 2 points, we will just write that into our equation right next to the x. So remember that the slope is also known as the rate of change. We know that in a graph, we can find it from rise over run, or in a table or 2 points, we always find it by doing the change in y over the change in x, where we subtract our y values and subtract our x values and write it in a ratio. This slope is really, really important that you always put it with your x value or your x variable. So anytime that we see our x, it is going to be called the coefficient, which means that all it means is just the number in front of the x letter. The other value that we need to know is also what we've been practicing over the past few days, and that is our b value, or what we've been practicing it as the y-intercept. The y-intercept is also known as our starting point. So it's the starting point of our graph. It's the starting point of a word problem. We'll be doing word problems here in a few weeks. To find the y-intercept from a graph, it's always where the line crosses the x-axis or the y-axis. And in a table, it is always when x equals 0. So also in that graph, whenever we're talking about crossing over that y-axis, that coordinate value is always 0, comma, and it's always this b value. So our b value deals with the letter that we're going to be putting in our equation. So whenever we have a number that is all by itself without the variable, this is going to be called a constant. The constant is the number that stands off all by itself at the very end of the equation. So let's practice identifying our slope and our y-intercept from these equations that are already given to you. So let's look at number 1. Number 1, I see that the number 3 is right in front of the x. Since that is my slope number, I'm just going to write 3 right here. And then my y-intercept is the number that is all by itself. That's a constant number. So my y-intercept is at 5 on the y-axis. On number 2, my slope is the number in front of my x value. So my slope is 1/2. That tells me if I have a rise or a run on my graph. And then my y-intercept, since there's no number off to this outside, whenever there's not a number, there's an invisible 0 there. So my y-intercept is at 0, which means that it would pass through the origin of the graph, or 0, 0 of the graph. On number 3, since there's not a number out in front of this x, there's always an invisible 1. And since there's a negative sign, that means my slope would be -1. And my y-intercept is this 3, but looking at the sign in front of that 3, I know that has to be -3. On number 4, the number in front of my x is 5/2. Remember that having an improper fraction is okay. And then my y-intercept is going to be at 1 on the y-axis. If you turn your paper over, we have more example problems. So we're going to be doing the same type of thing. We're going to be finding the slope and the y-intercept from tables and graphs, which we've been doing in the past. And then we're just going to take it a step further and actually put it into equation form. So looking at this, I am going to find my slope by finding my change in y over my change in x. So from 7 to 9, I'm adding 2, while in my x, I am adding 3. From 9 to 13, I'm adding 4. From 0 to 6, I'm adding 6. So my change in y is 2. My slope or my change in x would be 3. And then I also have a 4/6, which would just simplify down to 2/3. So that I know my slope is going to be 2/3. My y-intercept is always when my x value is 0. So when x is 0, my y-intercept is going to be at 9 on the y-axis. When I write my equation, I always have y equals, I always have a spot for x, and then the number in front of the x is going to be 2/3, because that's my slope. And then since my y-intercept is a +9, I would put +9. And then that's it. Once you find your slope and your y-intercept and you place it into your equation, you are done with answering that problem. The next one we are looking at is my change in y over change in x. So -8 to a -8 to 0 would be adding 8. From -4 or -1 to 3, I'm adding 4. From 0 to 6, I'm adding 6. From 3 to 6, I'm adding 3. So my change in y is 8/4. My change in y is 6/3. If I simplify all of that, my slope is going to be 2. My y-intercept for the second one is always when x is 0. Since I do not have a 0 in my x column, that means I have to make one. I have to make it work. So I can put a 0 here, and then I can use this same pattern of when I add 3, I'm going to add 6 in my y column. So from 0 to 3, I'm adding 3. Something plus 6 is going to equal 0. So this would mean that my y-intercept has to be -6. So my equation would be y equals, I'm going to put my slope, I'm going to put my x, and then my y-intercept is my constant, so it goes off all the way off to the side. My last table example, I'm adding 1 on my change of y while I'm adding 2 on my change of x. Over here, I'm adding 2 while I'm adding 4. So 1/2 and 2/4 would all simplify down to 1/2. And then my y-intercept is actually given to me when x is 0. I'm using my y value, so it will be 4. Once I get these two numbers, I can plug them into my equation. So my slope is 1/2. I put an x with it, and then I have a +4, so I put a +4 as my constant. I can do the same thing with graphs. I can find my slope and my y-intercept and then write my equation. So from one point to another point, since My lines go by ones. I'm going to go up and count by ones. So I'm going to go up 3 numbers and to the right 1 number. So my slope would be 3 over 1 or just 3. My y-intercept crosses at 0, 2. So my y-intercept would be at 2. And my equation would be y equals 3 as my slope. And then 2 is my y-intercept. My next example, I have a decreasing graph, so I know that my answer is going to be negative. My slope is going to be negative. So from one point to another point, I'm going to go down 1 and then to the right 3. So when I went down 1, that would be negative 1, and then to the right 3 would be a positive 3. Then my y-intercept is at 0, 0. So that means my y-intercept is going to be at 0 as my number. Then I would start my equation with y equals negative 1/3 x. And then if I want to put my plus 0, I can, or I don't need to add that part on to my equation. And then my last example doesn't have the points there for me, so I have to find them. One of my points will normally be on my y-axis, so I know that my y-intercept actually crosses at 4, so I can go ahead and write that down. My other point would be right here. So this is a decreasing graph as I read it from left to right. So I know that my slope is going to be negative. I'm going to be going down 1, 2, 3 lines, which represent 3 numbers. So down 3 numbers, and then to the right 2. So I would have negative 3 over 2. And then my equation is y equals negative 3 over 2x plus 4.